Rachel Maddow thought she could corner Jasmine Crockett with polling and pressure on live TV. Instead, America watched the queen of cable news go silent as a freshman congresswoman flipped the script with raw truth. When media power meets lived reality, who walks away standing, and who's left speechless before millions? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from, and if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. The MSNBC studio pulsed with anticipation, its walls glowing under a wash of hot white lights. Cameras glided smoothly along their tracks, circling the set like watchful eyes, ready to capture every twitch and gesture. Behind the glass, producers gestured urgently, watching the countdown clock tick toward zero. It wasn't just another primetime interview. Everyone in the control room sensed that something rare was about to unfold, the kind of exchange that would echo long after the cameras stopped rolling. Rachel Maddow sat at her desk with her familiar intensity, stacks of papers fanned in front of her like ammunition. Her signature glasses reflected the glare of the studio lights, giving her the look of a seasoned cross-examiner preparing to dismantle her opponent. Years of reputation trailed her into the room. The queen of progressive media, the woman's sharp intellect and relentless preparation had made presidents stumble and politicians sweat. Her confidence radiated from every movement, every pause. She had prepared to corner her guest, as she had done so many times before. Across from her, Jasmine Crockett embodied a different kind of power. The Texas Congresswoman leaned back in her chair with the poise of a trial lawyer who knew she had already won. Her posture was alert but not tense, her expression relaxed but focused, and her silence said more than Maddow's mountain of notes. She did not fidget, did not blink under the harsh lights. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years fighting uphill battles and walking away with victories. In the control booth, one producer whispered into a colleague's headset, "She's about to teach Rachel a lesson." The words hung in the air like prophecy. Everyone in the studio could sense the weight of what was coming. The clash of two powerhouses, one wielding research and reputation, the other armed with lived truth and courtroom steel. A quick montage flashed across screens, Maddow leaning forward, eyes burning with intensity, Crockett unmoving, calm as stone. The duel of wills had begun, though neither had yet spoken a word, and soon, before millions, silence itself would become the weapon that shattered expectation. For more than 15 years, Rachel Maddow had built a fortress of influence around herself, brick by brick, episode by episode. Every night at 9 p.m., 2 million Americans tuned in to MSNBC to hear her sharp analysis, her relentless investigations, and her trademark ability to reduce complicated political scandals into must-watch television. With a reported salary of $7 million a year, Maddow was not simply a host, she was an institution, a liberal icon whose voice could make or break a career. When Maddow spoke, the Democratic base listened, and when she raised questions, politicians scrambled to answer them. Her reputation rested on her methodical style. She didn't overwhelm guests with raw aggression. Instead, she came armed with towering stacks of documents, each page prepared to expose contradictions or hypocrisies. Politicians who sat across from her often found themselves buried under her document dumps, unable to wriggle out from beneath the weight of receipts. Her team of researchers worked tirelessly to ensure that by the time the cameras rolled, Maddow knew more about her guest's record than they did themselves. It was this relentless preparation that earned her the reputation of being one of the most feared interviewers in American media. But Maddow's power extended beyond the confines of her studio. She wasn't just a journalist reporting stories. She was shaping the national narrative. Her monologues regularly set the agenda for the next day's political conversation. Her opinions were echoed on podcasts, in odds even deads in congressional hearing rooms. Presidents and party leaders monitored her segments because they understood she spoke directly to the Democratic base. To appear on her show was both an honor and a trial, a chance to reach millions, but also a test of endurance against one of the toughest interrogators in broadcast news. And yet, behind the fortress of credibility, Maddow carried her own agenda. In recent months, she had turned her sights on the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. To her, figures like Jasmine Crockett embodied a dangerous gamble. Policies such as Medicare for all, student debt cancellation, or expansive climate initiatives, Maddow argued, threatened to alienate moderates and suburban swing voters. She believed progressives were jeopardizing the party's electability by insisting on ideals that polls suggested were unpopular. Her show had become a steady drumbeat of warnings against overreach, complete with experts, charts, and polling data to prove the case. For Maddow, the stakes were enormous. She wasn't just defending her reputation as a hard-hitting journalist. She was defending her worldview, that pragmatic, carefully calibrated politics was the only way Democrats could hold power. The fortress she built was not merely one of facts and documents. It was a fortress of ideology, one that she believed kept the party safe from self-destruction. But that night, across from her, sat someone who wasn't intimidated by the fortress at all. Jasmine Crockett's journey to that MSNBC studio was forged in fire, not comfort. Before she ever set foot in Congress, she had been a civil rights attorney in Texas, taking on the kinds of cases most lawyers avoided. She fought banks that systematically denied loans to black families, battled corporations exploiting workers, and defended voting rights in districts where suppression was supremely in the system. These weren't abstract battles. They were personal, visceral fights that put her directly against entrenched power, and more often than not, she walked away with victories that mattered to the people who had no other champion. Her work earned her a reputation not as a polished politician, but as a fighter. When Crockett arrived in Washington, she didn't come with the polish of focus group talking points. She came with courtroom instincts and an unshakable belief that politics should serve working families, not donors or corporate interests. In just a few short years, she had gone from a freshman representative to a rising progressive voice, whose speeches regularly went viral. Her following on social media exploded as clips of her fiery House floor arguments were shared across platforms. She spoke plainly, with sharp edges and unpolished authenticity, and that was precisely why people listened. What made Crockett uniquely dangerous in a setting like Maddow's studio was her training as a trial lawyer. She knew how to dismantle questions, how to refuse the framing imposed by her opponent, and how to redirect a conversation to the ground she chose. In a courtroom, she had faced prosecutors, corporate lawyers, and judges, all trying to box her in. She had learned never to take the bait, never to fight on terms dictated by the other side. Instead, she reframed, restructured, and turned pressure back on the questioner. That instinct made her immune to the tactics Maddow had perfected over decades. Her style was not academic or cautious. It was sharp, direct, and disarmingly authentic. Where Maddow leaned on rehearsed lines and rehearsed questions, Crockett leaned on lived experience and instinct. She didn't care about television polish or journalistic conventions. She cared about results, about speaking directly to the people watching at home who knew what it meant to choose between rent and medicine. And because she wasn't bound by media etiquette, she could say things that left her opponent speechless. The stakes for Crockett were as high as they were for Maddow, but in a different way. She was not defending an empire of ratings or a fortress of influence. She was defending the progressive movement itself, the idea that Democrats didn't need to water down their message to win, that bold policies energized voters rather than scared them away. She represented a new generation of leaders who refused to bow to media gatekeepers, who believed that accountability applied not just to politicians but to the very platforms that claimed to hold them accountable. That night, as the lights blazed and the cameras rolled, the two worlds collided. Maddow's fortress of establishment credibility met Crockett's fire of lived truth. And between them hung the question that would define the confrontation. Could decades of media power withstand the force of a trial lawyer who had never learned how to back down? The opening question landed like a carefully sharpened blade. Rachel Maddow leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind the glare of her glasses, and delivered what seemed, at first, like a neutral inquiry. "Congresswoman Crockett," she began, "there's been a lot of polling suggesting that progressive Democrats, particularly those pushing Medicare for all and climate policies like the Green New Deal, are turning off moderates and suburban voters. Don't you think there's a danger that your wing of the party could cost Democrats crucial elections?" It was vintage Maddow. Present the question as if it were rooted in data, then load it with the assumption that the guest was already guilty. For years, politicians had stumbled over this tactic, scrambling to prove that they weren't liabilities, trying desperately to distance themselves from their own policies. The producers behind the glass smiled knowingly. This was supposed to be the moment where Maddow forced Crockett into the defensive posture. That made for good television. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't lean back or stumble for an answer. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, a small smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Rachel," she said calmly, "before we talk polling, shouldn't we talk results?" Her voice was measured, steady, deliberate, because the data I'm looking at tells a very different story. The response was disarming in its simplicity. Maddow blinked, caught off guard by the refusal to accept the framing of the question. Most politicians would have rushed into an explanation, but Crockett had done something different. She had turned the question back on Maddow, rejecting the starter premise entirely. The audience could feel it, a subtle but undeniable shift in momentum. Crockett leaned forward now, her posture composed but assertive. "In my district, one of the reddest in Texas, I ran on Medicare for all, on housing reform, on protecting voting rights, and guess what? I won. Not because I watered down my message, but because I gave people something worth showing up for. So if polls are telling you that these policies are poison, maybe the problem isn't the policies. Maybe the problem is how the questions are being asked." A ripple of energy ran through the studio. Maddow's eyebrows arched slightly, her lips tightening into the faintest frown. The question had been designed to corner Crockett, but instead Crockett had flipped it with a lawyer's precision. The audience, both in the studio and across television screens, could sense it immediately. Maddow wasn't dealing with an ordinary guest. In the control booth, one producer muttered, "This isn't going according to script." Maddow, unwilling to lose her footing so early, shuffled her papers with exaggerated emphasis, a performance designed to remind viewers of her preparation. "But Congresswoman," she pressed, "with all due respect, isn't it irresponsible to push policies that polling consistently shows are unpopular with the very voters Democrats need to win? Virginia, New Jersey, suburban districts across the country. When progressives talk about defunding the police or Medicare for all, Democrats struggle. Don't you bear some responsibility for that?" The word hung in the air like a hammer blow. Irresponsible. It was Maddow's attempt to assert dominance, to put Crockett on the defensive and cast her as reckless. For most politicians, the label would have been toxic. But Crockett's expression didn't flicker. Instead, she leaned forward, her eyes steady, and delivered a question of her own. "Rachel, when was the last time you had to choose between paying your rent and paying for prescription drugs?" The studio went silent. Maddow blinked, caught off guard. Her rehearsed rhythm faltered for the first time. "I don't think my personal circumstances are really relevant," she began, but Crockett cut her off, her tone firm but calm. "Oh, but they are. Because you're sitting here in a studio making millions of dollars a year telling working families they should accept less. You call it irresponsible for us to fight for health care, housing, and education, but I call it irresponsible to ignore the struggles people are living through every single day." The audience shifted uneasily, sensing the dynamic reversing in real time. Maddow, who had built her brand on putting politicians in the hot seat, now looked like the one on trial. The camera caught her face as the confidence began to slip, her jaw tightening as she shuffled through her notes. Crockett pressed the point, her voice rising with conviction. "What's truly irresponsible is telling people that wanting affordable health care is too radical, that fighting for clean air and water is too extreme, that asking to graduate college without a lifetime of debt is unrealistic. Rachel, the only thing unrealistic is thinking this country can survive if we keep telling families to settle for less." The blow landed. Viewers across the country could see it. The hypocrisy of a multi-million-dollar media figure scolding an elected official for demanding policies that addressed basic survival. Maddow, for once, looked rattled. The cracks were showing, and Crockett was just getting started. Maddow tried one last time to regain her authority. She leaned forward, her voice sharper now, tinged with frustration. "Congresswoman, this all sounds very passionate, but rhetoric doesn't win elections. Strategy does. Isn't there a danger that this kind of rhetoric, while emotionally compelling, ultimately costs Democrats power?" Crockett's eyes sharpened. She didn't raise her voice. but her words carried the weight of a closing argument. Rhetoric? Is it rhetoric when families are rationing insulin because they can't afford it? Is it rhetoric when kids drop out of college because the debt is crushing them before they even start their lives? Is it rhetoric when families in my district live in their cars because they can't afford rent? Those aren't talking points, Rachel. Those are lives. The studio held its breath. Maddow opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. But camera zoomed in, capturing her silence in stunning clarity. Crockett didn't let the moment pass. She reached into her jacket, pulled out her phone, and unlocked it with deliberate calm. You want numbers? Let's talk numbers. She scrolled briefly, then held the phone up. In 2022, every Democrat who co-sponsored Medicare for All and actually campaigned on it won their election. Every single one, but Democrats who ran away from progressive policies, they lost. So if we're talking strategy, maybe the problem isn't the policies, it's the fear. Maddow shifted in her chair, her composure unraveling. Crockett's tone grew sharper, more final. Maybe the problem isn't my message. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten what this fight is really about. The line cut through the studio like a blade. Maddow sat frozen, her face pale under the lights, her silence deafening. The queen of cable news, whose reputation was built on quick wit and relentless questioning, had no words. Crockett stood up, adjusting her jacket with the calm assurance of someone leaving a courtroom after delivering a winning verdict. She looked down at Maddow, then directly into the camera. When you're ready to have a real conversation about fighting for working families, you know where to find me. And with that, she walked off set. The cameras scrambled to follow. Producers panicked behind the glass, and Maddow remained at her desk, staring blankly, utterly speechless. It lasted only seconds, but the image was unforgettable. Jasmine Crockett walking tall, Rachel Maddow sitting silent. And in that silence, the internet, the political world, and the very definition of media power were about to explode. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Rachel Maddow lasted less than 10 minutes on live television, but its aftershocks detonated across the internet in seconds. The moment Crockett delivered her final line, "Maybe the problem isn't my message. Maybe the problem is that you've forgotten what this fight is about," clips began circulating before the show had even cut to commercial. One staffer in the MSNBC control room whispered, "It's already on Twitter," even as Maddow sat frozen in silence at her desk. Within 5 minutes, the first clip hit 500,000 views. By the half-hour mark, the hashtag Crockett Energy had vaulted into the top 10 trends nationwide. By midnight, tens of millions had seen the footage. Maddow's stunned expression, captured in a tight camera shot as her voice deserted her, was screenshotted and memified endlessly. Some captions read, "When the receipts are too real." Others simply said, "This is what happens when live truth meets TV spin." The internet's creativity went into overdrive. On TikTok, teenagers set Crockett's takedown to dramatic orchestral music, syncing the words, "Is it rhetoric when families ration insulin," to pounding drums. Another viral edit spliced her walk-off with sports highlights, as though she were an athlete scoring a game-winning shot. On Instagram, artists illustrated Crockett's exit from the set as a modern political painting, her figure outlined in gold light while Maddow sat in shadow. The clip transcended politics. It became pop culture. Late-night comedy jumped on the moment with glee. One host recreated Maddow's silence by sitting at his desk for 10 full seconds before taking a sip of water, the audience howling. Another show ran a parody where two actors played Maddow and Crockett, repeating the dialogue word for word until Crockett's line about $7 million to tell families to settle brought the crowd to its feet. Even international outlets joined the frenzy. The BBC called it a clash that revealed fault lines inside America's progressive movement. Le Monde described it as a televised trial where the lawyer won and the journalist lost. But it wasn't just comedy or memes driving the virality. It was the hunger behind the reaction. Viewers who had long felt that liberal media elites were untouchable suddenly saw proof that they could be challenged and even defeated on their own stage. The image of Maddow, one of the most prepared and respected interviewers in the country, left speechless, carried symbolic weight. For many, it wasn't just about Crockett versus Maddow. It was about authenticity versus performance, lived struggle versus detached analysis. By the next morning, the phrase "receipts not rhetoric" was trending globally. Every social media platform replayed Crockett's calm dismantling of Maddow's assumptions, while Maddow's faltering attempts to pivot were dissected like missteps in a high-stakes chess match. Cable networks scrambled to cover the fallout, replaying the clip with analysts debating whether Maddow had underestimated Crockett or simply been unprepared for her directness. The consensus was clear. The exchange had shifted something fundamental in American political discourse. What began as a heated interview had exploded into a viral detonation. Crockett hadn't just survived Maddow's trap. She had walked out of the studio with a moment that belonged not to cable news, but to the people who spread it, meme by meme, clip by clip, until it became a cultural earthquake. The reaction was swift, loud, and bipartisan in ways few expected. Progressive leaders were the first to weigh in. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeted within an hour of the broadcast, "This is what it looks like when someone refuses to be bullied into silence." Rep. Crockett reminded us who we're fighting for. Her post racked up hundreds of thousands of likes, amplified by activists who had been frustrated with media criticism of progressive policies. Bernie Sanders followed, posting, "What Jasmine Crockett said was simple. Healthcare, housing, education. These are not radical demands. They are human rights. The fight for working families is not irresponsible. It is necessary." But the response wasn't limited to progressives. Moderates, who had often bristled at the left flank of their party, privately admitted respect for Crockett's composure. One Democratic senator, speaking anonymously, told reporters, "She said what a lot of us have been thinking. Sometimes the media treats politics like a game instead of remembering that people's lives are at stake." Even conservative commentators, despite disagreeing with Crockett's policies, tipped their hats. One right-leaning talk show host said, "You don't have to agree with her politics to admire what she did. She stood up to one of the most powerful media figures in the country and didn't blink. That takes guts." The wave of support extended far beyond politicians. Social media became a battleground of celebration. Activists flooded platforms with grassroots donations, citing Crockett's defense of working families as their inspiration. In just 48 hours, her campaign raised more money than it had in the previous 3 months combined. Donors left notes attached to their contributions. "Thank you for saying what we've been feeling. This is why we need fighters in Congress. You reminded me why I vote." The phrase "pulling a Crockett" began to spread as slang among younger audiences. It meant refusing to bow to intimidation, especially from authority figures who expected deference. Students used it jokingly in classrooms, standing up to teachers with humor and confidence. But it also carried weight in activist spaces. To pull a Crockett was to reclaim power, to insist that one's truth mattered, even in hostile environments. The reach of the moment extended into unexpected places. At veterans' halls, men and women who had served whispered that Crockett's blunt truth reminded them of the accountability they'd always valued, plain speech over polished spin. In churches, pastors quoted her line about "forgotten what this fight is about," framing as a call to remember moral responsibility. In dorm rooms, students replayed the clip not just for entertainment but for inspiration, seeing in Crockett a model of authenticity rarely displayed on national television. The internet, of course, immortalized Maddow's silence. Memes of her stunned face multiplied, captioned with everything from "when you realize the receipts are real" to "that moment when the argument ends you." But the most shared images weren't mocking Maddow. They were celebrating Crockett. Screenshots of her calm expression, her walk off, her pointed gaze into the camera became icons of defiance. The response from Ameri was overwhelming. Crockett's words had cut across ideological lines, reshaping the conversation not only about progressive policies, but about the power dynamics between politicians and the media. The clapback had become something larger, a rallying cry for courage in the face of establishment intimidation. The aftershocks of the confrontation began to shift the political landscape almost immediately. Progressive organizations, emboldened by Crockett's example, started rethinking their media strategies. For years, appearances on shows like Maddow's had been treated as mandatory rites of passage, opportunities to prove legitimacy within the Democratic Party. But Crockett's performance shattered that assumption. Progressive leaders began to ask, why seek approval from media gatekeepers when direct communication with voters could be more powerful? Justice Democrats issued a memo within a week of the interview, encouraging candidates to take a more confrontational approach when faced with hostile or dismissive media framing. The Sunrise Movement launched a campaign called Receipts First, urging politicians to come armed with evidence and to reject narratives designed to box them into corners. It wasn't about disrespecting the media, it was about refusing to let journalists dictate the boundaries of acceptable discourse. Meanwhile, the liberal media establishment found itself under uncomfortable scrutiny. Commentators and academics debated whether figures like Maddow had become less watchdogs and more gatekeepers, protecting the party establishment rather than challenging power. Opinion columns accused MSNBC of growing too comfortable with its own authority, forgetting that journalism's role was to hold all power accountable, not just Republican power. The confrontation became a mirror held up to the industry itself. For Crockett personally, the power shift was unmistakable. In just 48 hours, her campaign donations skyrocketed, surpassing totals from the previous quarter. Grassroots donors fueled the surge, but major progressive donors also took notice. Suddenly, Crockett wasn't just a promising new voice, she was a proven force. Political consultants who had dismissed her as too radical now scrambled to study her technique. Training manuals for candidates began to include a new maxim: don't attack what you can't back up. Don't fear the gatekeepers. Even moderates began recalibrating. Some Democrats who had once avoided progressive language started softening their stances, aware that Crockett's success proved there was appetite for bolder messaging. Republicans, for their part, seized on Maddow's humiliation to argue that liberal media was fractured, using the clip as evidence that Democrats were eating their own. But even in their criticism, they acknowledged the potency of Crockett's performance. The foreshadowing of bigger consequences was everywhere. Commentators predicted that this single confrontation could shape the tone of the 2026 elections. If progressives embraced Crockett's model, the Democratic Party would look less like a cautious coalition and more like a movement fueled by unapologetic authenticity. If media elites doubled down, the rift between grassroots energy and cable news orthodoxy would only deepen. What was clear, though, was that the balance of power had shifted. Crockett had shown that politicians didn't have to play by the old rules, that truth spoken with conviction could break through even the most fortified media defenses. The clip wasn't just viral entertainment, it was a blueprint. And as activists, candidates, and voters rallied around her, the question lingered. Had America just witnessed the moment when a new political era began? The morning after the clash, journalism schools across the country scrambled to update their syllabi. What had begun as a fiery television exchange was now being framed as a turning point in modern media. Professors at Columbia and Northwestern dissected the footage in lecture halls, pausing on Rachel Maddow's faltering silence, highlighting it as the moment interviewer lost control of the narrative. Students were taught that authority in journalism was no longer guaranteed by studio lights or decades of reputation. It had to be earned, minute by minute, against guests who refused to play by the old rules. In political science classrooms, Crockett's performance was elevated into a case study. Scholars called it the Crockett Principle, the art of shifting power by refusing the frame imposed on you. Instead of being dragged into Maddow's polling questions, Crockett had flipped the conversation to lived reality, grounding her answers in the tangible struggles of ordinary Americans. Students debated what this meant for democratic discourse. Was it proof that authenticity trumped carefully staged narratives, or a warning that traditional media could no longer referee politics? Either way, the lesson echoed. Control of the microphone did not guarantee control of the message. Outside of academia, the cultural wildfire burned brighter. Memes flooded social media within hours. Maddow's frozen expression became a reaction image used by teenagers to mock everything from bad cafeteria lunches to student debt bills. Crockett's walk-off was edited into TikTok dances, her phone-raising gesture remixed with hip-hop beats. Young people adopted the hashtag Crockett Energy and Rehearsed, not rhetoric, not just as slogans but as identity markers, shorthand for rejecting empty talking points and demanding proof. Merchandise sellers capitalized instantly. Online shops printed t-shirts with bold block letters, receipts greater than rhetoric. Hoodies carried Crockett's final words. Maybe the problem is you've forgotten what this fight is about. Stickers of Maddow's stunned face appeared on laptops and skateboards. In a culture where moments moved fast, this one had staying power. It wasn't just a viral laugh, it was a generational anthem. Soon, the phrase, "Don't just talk, show proof," emerged as a new civic expectation. Town halls, school board meetings, even workplace debates began echoing it. High school students, emboldened by the clip, started challenging administrators with facts pulled from their phones. Ordinary citizens used Crockett's method, calm, deliberate, receipt-driven, circumvent local politicians. What had started as a clash between two powerhouses in a Manhattan studio had spilled far beyond the screen, reshaping how Americans demanded accountability. Cultural critics called it a shift in epistemology, a fancy way of saying that the ground rules for truth were changing. For years, television had rewarded volume, intensity, and sound bites. But Crockett's intervention suggested that plain-spoken facts, wielded with conviction, could pierce louder than any scripted performance. In a time when trust in institutions was crumbling, this cultural fallout signaled something different. People were tired of being told what to believe. They wanted proof. And Crockett had given them a blueprint. If the cultural landscape was rocked, the political world was an earthquake zone. Within hours of the clip's explosion, Democratic leaders scrambled to position themselves. Progressive figures like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders wasted no time in amplifying the moment. They posted support on social media, calling Crockett's stand against Maddow a masterclass in courage. Sanders went further, tweeting that her refusal to bow to media gatekeeping was exactly what this movement needs. Suddenly, Crockett wasn't just a rising congresswoman. She was a symbol of unfiltered progressive energy. But not everyone in the Democratic Party was comfortable. Moderates privately admitted admiration, confessing that she said what many Americans think, but in public they hedged. Some worried that alienating Maddow, a cornerstone of liberal media, could fracture donor networks or unsettle the carefully balanced alliances needed for national campaigns. Behind closed doors, strategists debated whether Crockett was a lightning rod or the future of the party. The fact they were even asking the question revealed her growing weight. Republicans, meanwhile, saw an opportunity. Conservative media gleefully replayed the clip, not to endorse Crockett's progressive policies, but to weaponize Maddow's humiliation. Fox News anchors framed it as proof that liberal elites are crumbling under their own contradictions. Right-wing commentators, while disagreeing with Crockett's politics, praised her willingness to stand up to establishment figures on her own side. Oddly, some conservatives began saying, "I don't like what she stands for, but I respect her spine." In the strange logic of modern politics, Crockett had done what few could, earn begrudging admiration across the aisle. Donors noticed too. Crockett's campaign site nearly crashed from a surge in grassroots contributions. Small donations poured in, many accompanied by notes referencing her walk-off moment. In just 48 hours, she raised more than she had in the previous 3 months combined. Political consultants began whispering, if this momentum held, Crockett wasn't just a congresswoman, she was a national contender. In Washington, whispers turned to strategy. Progressive organizations began rethinking how to approach media. Why keep bowing to gatekeepers who tried to box them in? Crockett's performance showed that a direct confrontational stance could yield more attention and more support than playing by the old rules. The calculus of risk had changed, and the appetite for fresh voices grew. For Maddow, the political fallout was harsher. Though still respected, her aura of invincibility was punctured. Colleagues joked quietly about getting Crocketted. For years, she had been the one setting traps. Now she had become the cautionary tale. By the week's end, one thing was undeniable. Crockett had crossed a threshold. She was no longer just a Texas congresswoman. She had become the face of a generation unwilling to defer, unwilling to settle, unwilling to play the game by rules designed to keep them small. The fallout was not a setback. It was the foundation of something larger. And the political class knew it. In the end, the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Rachel Maddow wasn't just another viral clip. It wasn't just a clash of personalities on television. It was a reminder that power in America is shifting away from the carefully guarded gates of legacy media and back towards the people who live the realities politicians and pundits so often talk around. Crockett didn't win because she yelled the loudest. She didn't win because she had the flashiest line. She won because she carried receipts. Because her voice was rooted in truth, lived experience, and an unwavering refusal to let anyone rewrite the terms of the debate. She proved that courage isn't about pleasing the room, It's about standing your ground, even when the lights are brightest and the stakes are highest. That's why the moment hit so hard. Millions of Americans recognized themselves in her words. They saw their struggles reflected on a stage that usually talks over them. When Crockett raised her phone and read out real election data, when she reminded the country that families rationing insulin and kids drowning in debt are not rhetoric, but reality, she did more than win a debate. She set a new standard. For too long, our conversations have been controlled by those who benefit from keeping the frame narrow, safe, and predictable. Maddow thought she could corner Crockett with polls, with labels, with the same tired narrative about what's electable. Instead, Crockett turned that moment inside out and showed us that what's truly electable is authenticity. What's powerful is telling the truth even when it makes the establishment uncomfortable. That's the energy we need going forward. Not just in Congress, not just on cable news, but in every school board meeting, every city council, every workplace where people are told to sit down and accept less than they deserve. Crockett's stand reminds us that courage isn't rare. It's waiting in all of us. It just needs to be claimed. So here's the challenge. Don't let this moment fade into just another clip that trends for a week and disappears. Take it with you. Use it. The next time someone tries to dismiss your concerns with a statistic that erases your life, pull out your own receipts. The next time you're told to settle, remind them that settling is what created the problems we're fighting today. And when someone tries to make you feel small for demanding better, remember Jasmine Crockett walking off that set, leaving silence in her wake. Because sometimes silence says more than words ever could. This is about more than politics. It's about dignity, accountability, and the future we're building together. If you believe in that fight, don't just watch, participate. Share this story, talk about it with your friends. Support leaders who refuse to bow to intimidation, and most of all, carry this truth with you. The receipts matter more than the rhetoric. Always have, always will.